3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
Good morning and welcome to the Daily Equipment Walkaround. I'm Ted Polzer, Director of Product and Customer Support, and with me today is Brad.
Hi, I'm Brad Stemper, Director of Light Equipment for Case Construction.
We're going to talk to you today about some of the points that you want to be paying attention to on your daily equipment needs. With taking a look at some of the components on the machine, we want to make sure that we point out those critical areas that are going to minimize your owning and operating costs and also maximize your uptime.
And along with those value points that maintaining your machine gives you, there's also an intrinsic value to doing it, right? You're going to be observing that machine on a regular basis. Developing a routine for your operators or even for yourself, if you're the one sitting in the seat, can be really beneficial because you're going to notice the little changes in that machine over time. You're going to notice daily things, like if something got damaged yesterday during operation, maybe your tracks or tires have a new cut, maybe there's an oil point that's gathering dust and dirt. You're going to notice those because as you look over the machine and develop this routine for yourself, it's that progress or that observation that's going to really give you that insight.
Well, good. We're going to start with tracks and tires and some of the things that you need to be paying attention to in order to maximize your uptime. So we'll start with a CTL, and as you take a look at these machines with the rubber track, it's important to look for cracks, damage, maybe debris that is jammed in. Maybe you hit something sharp that's stuck through the tread. Those are all things that you want to be monitoring and looking for that are going to try to prevent any larger type opportunities for you. But in addition to just the rubber tires and tracks, as an example, in this case, we also want to be taking a look at rollers and idlers. Now, we need to be careful when we talk about idlers and rollers because generally an idler or roller, unless it has an obvious oil leak that's easy to spot, sometimes can be very, very hot. So we recommend that customers don't actually touch these components after the machine's been running because it can burn you. They are extremely hot. What we like to use is either a cheap temp gun that's available anywhere on the internet, or in this case, we actually use a LibraStream cube with thermal imaging. And thermal imaging is a great way to be able to take a look at an overall of a machine where you can identify hot spots. So for us, we can clearly point out a roller that's extremely hot that needs attention. Now we start talking a little bit about tires. So as we kind of focus back here on this tire pressure is extremely important with your machines, and underinflated tires can create excessive heat. That heat can lead to shorter life of those tires. It can also prematurely wear tires as far as the tread goes. So it is extremely important to monitor that every day that you get started, and you can either do that through the use of an air pressure gauge, or you can do kind of a visual on them if you know that they've been set properly to that job site when you first got started. Brad?
Absolutely. The next point I'm going to go ahead and mention here is the daily service checks on this machine. Now, whether it's a skid steer, compact track loader, a wheel loader, or an excavator, just about every operator knows how to go ahead and open up the hood, the access panel, right to the engine compartment. So that's going to be very familiar. But what may not be familiar is understanding all the different points of reference for you in this engine compartment, right? You're going to have diesel fill, diesel exhaust fluid, fill. So you're going to have a number of points that you're going to be able to access and routinely fill. But there's also going to be other points. You're going to be looking at fluid levels such as hydraulics or coolant fluid level. You're going to go ahead and observe where your engine intake filter is, maybe even your jump start terminal, your master disconnect. So you're going to want to pay attention to your machine and become familiarized with those points of reference, because those should be part of your daily inspection. Whether it's before the operation or after the operation, you're going to want to verify that this thing is ready to go for you when you need it to operate, okay? There's a lot on the different machines. Some machines have more space, some machines have less space. So again, becoming familiar with it will definitely help you out, because it'll also create that routine. Now, additionally, back here on the engine compartment, whether it's this machine or one of the others behind us, you want to also be observant of that debris or that material that might be collecting during your operation day. It's not something that you should have to clean every day, That depends on your application, obviously. Some applications, situations where there's a lot of airborne debris, you might literally need to clean on a daily basis, or even more frequently than a daily basis. But you want to be observant of where material is collecting. Okay, opening it up, looking, is it getting into the radiator? Is it collecting? Is it clogging the radiator? Anything like that is obviously going to be detrimental to the machine's operation and the efficiency of how the engine works. You want to keep that radiator cool, and any kind of material that blocks airflow is definitely going to make that machine run more hot. Okay, you're going to be looking underneath. You might be looking on top. For this machine, it's got an air conditioning condenser up on top. You're going to want to go ahead and verify that it's not clogging any airflow up there. Even on top, the rear deck, or in and around the vents on a full-size wheel loader, an excavator, or any other product, you're going to want to make sure that's not clogging that entry point of that air. Okay, you're also going to be observing which way the air flows. On these machines, it tends to come in through the top and out through the rear. So that's something to be aware of, because obviously that's going to drive or help you understand where that material might also be collecting. So, Ted, anything else to add on that, or?
No, I think those are great points. I mean, especially if you have like an excavator, there are certain machines that have chaff screens, and those chaff screens are something that you want to check. It makes it a little easier to clean out coolers and things like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually move over to checking the filters. So as we take a look on this unit and we walk over here, one of the most common areas that's actually overlooked are cab filters, right? Engine filters are always the first thing that customers think of, and normally those are addressed pretty frequently. But in this case, like on this wheel loader, as an example, we have a cab filter right here. It's easily accessible. It's something that's overlooked, especially when you start, if maybe it's a really, really hot day and you start to notice, hey, my AC isn't performing like it normally does, or something along those lines. It's a great opportunity to open this up, drop that filter cartridge out, and check. If it's packed full of debris, it's definitely time for a filter. Shaking out the filter or trying to blow it out, it's gonna get you out of a pinch, but really there's a lot of debris that's in that filter that needs to be changed to truly get rid of that and give you optimum airflow. Along with that, another consideration is, we're gonna walk a little bit back here towards the engine, are fuel filters. So if you have a prepaid maintenance program that you're already working with your dealer on, these filters should be probably already changed at the right frequency. However, if you do your own maintenance, one of the tips and tricks that I always recommend is mark the date, time, and hours that you actually performed that last filter change, so that you know what life is on these. And it's not just because of tracking hours it's important. It's important to understand that if you had, let's say that you had some dirty fuel that was delivered, and that may have gotten into a few different machines, at least you know the last time that filter was changed, so you would know, yep, this machine probably needs those filters changed. And that way you're not just changing filters blindly either, that don't need to be maintained. The other thing, as we're back here too, is to pay attention to belts. As on this machine there is a guard over it. Most of our machines do have a guard. It is important every once in a while to periodically glance inside of here, make sure that there isn't debris around the belt, make sure that you don't have any guards contacting that belt, which can prematurely wear those, and then also inspect the belt itself. Cracks, if you start to see wear where it's through cords or something like that associated with the belt, these are clearly keys that are telling you you're going to need to change a belt. One of the other things that I also recommend is that it is cheap insurance to have a spare belt with you on your truck. And so when you buy your machine, when you take delivery of it, talk to your parts department, make sure that you have a belt, throw it in the truck, because it's something that'll really help you get through a day in a pinch if you run into an issue with that. Brad?
Excellent. Thank you, Ted. In addition to helping you get through the day, you want to keep that machine moving as efficiently and as it should be. And so a big part of keeping that machine operational for you and making it productive is to make sure that you've maintained that grease points, okay? We need you, the first thing that any operator should do is also open up that operator's manual and familiarize themselves with the grease points and the frequency for those. As we mentioned already, some grease points are daily, every 8 hours, every 10 or 12 hours. Some grease points aren't as frequent. They might be 50 hours of greasing. But it's important to understand that it's not just simply connecting something or that grease gun to that point. It's the appropriate number of grease fills or pumps, if you want to call it that, okay? Not all grease points require you to pump until something comes out of that grease spot, okay? That's kind of an understanding you might have learned from your parents or from someone within the industry before you, to go ahead and pump until something comes out. But that's not always the appropriate thing to do. So again, be familiar with where your grease points are. There's often diagrams on the machine, definitely inside the operator's manual, and aware of how many grease pumps each one of those points take. So I'm standing at the front of the machine right now, at the front of this excavator, because this is kind of one of those spots that might often get overlooked a little bit too, okay? It's easy to get to for the most part, but sometimes you gotta orient the machine. And operators can sometimes bypass certain points that might be higher up on the machine if there aren't remote grease circs. And so we want to make sure that the operators are making sure or understanding that they've got to do those points with regularity, with frequency and consistency. The other thing that I want to point out here is, being an excavator, this area of the machine is often below ground or even in wet, even underwater conditions. And that moisture and dirt that is around those components can obviously embed or get into those rotating points. The benefit of grease is to give new fluid film to that rotation area. And so if you've got dirt and moisture that's kind of sticking in there, holding that material in there, one, it could corrode more quickly. Two, it could create poor operation, a lot more friction. And three, it's going to make the machine more noisy, okay? So spending time making sure that you're greasing those areas is going to make the machine more efficient, okay? And lastly about this, as this area of the machine is underground or digging, and it's also prone for some of these components to go ahead and get damaged, whether it's the cylinders, the rods, the pivot points, or even the tubes going and supplying that hydraulic oil to those areas. This is also an opportunity when you're doing those greasing point checks or filling the grease in those spots. You're going to go ahead and look and observe and do a visual inspection on some of these tubes to make sure that you don't have a line that's bulging, a dinged or nicked tube or cylinder that could also prevent operation or prematurely stop your operation. So those are all important points to understand while you're looking at the grease points on the machine.
Thanks, Brad. So the other thing we want to talk a little bit about is identifying leaks. So, you know, sometimes these machines are covered in material, right? They can be muddy. It makes it a little more difficult for that, but in the morning as the machine's been sitting, oftentimes gravity's going to be our friend, and if you do have a leak, we're going to start to see that, right? Whether that be maybe along rollers, maybe along like some axle seals or something like that. But primarily, one of the things that we really try to monitor and pay attention to is looking for accumulations of dirt in certain areas. Anytime we have a fitting that's leaking or things like that, we start to get oil residue, and oil residue attracts dirt, especially in dusty environments. So with that said, what we really like to do is try to focus, when we take a look at like this bucket cylinder right here, we're going to take a look at the fitting, make sure that we don't have like an accumulation of debris. We look up at the rod and even into the gland seal a little bit just to see, do we have an accumulation of dust and debris that's there? That indication can save you a lot of time and money, because obviously we are not to a mode where we are in a failure standpoint, but we can now approach the dealer and say, hey, I have a leak that I'd like to have addressed, or maybe it's just a fitting and it just takes a couple of wrenches to be able to torque that down to make sure that you're going to avoid any leaks. The other opportunity as well is a lot of these machines come with UV reactant dye in the oil, and it takes a relatively inexpensive type UV flashlight that can make that glow or shine, and it will give you a really good indication of where a leak is coming from if it's in a tight area, maybe underneath the cab or on a skid steer back underneath the engine. So those are all things to consider. If it's a machine that you don't know if it has UV reactant dye, that's another thing that can be added to oil as well, relatively inexpensive, and it makes it for a real easy identification of any of those areas. So Brad?
Absolutely. Continuing with the hydraulics a little bit, let's talk about auxiliary hydraulics. So we've got a compact track loader here, and we've got two sets of auxiliary hydraulics. You might have the auxiliary hydraulics on the excavator like we were just showing you, or even on a wheel loader or a backhoe or something else. So be aware of your auxiliary hydraulics. If you are a frequent user of auxiliary attachments requiring the use of those hydraulics, take note of those, right? Some operators put a bucket on, they go to work all day with that bucket, they don't do much else with auxiliary hydraulics. But if you are operating auxiliary hydraulics, it's an absolutely vital spot to pay attention to, okay? So this machine, we've got enhanced high flow on the left side, we've got standard flow on the right, and then additionally, if normal high flow were on this machine, you'd have additional set of ports right there. The best thing to do about auxiliary hydraulic ports, if you're changing those attachments, is to carry a rag with you. Leave it in the machine, carry it with you, make sure it's a clean rag. The worst thing to do is go ahead and clean something with a dirty rag, okay? So, but what you want to do is before you connect those ports, you want to make sure those ports are clean. You don't want to introduce any dirt on the attachment hose connection or on the machine connection into the hydraulics by shoving it in without cleaning it. So make sure those ports are clean. The other thing to keep in mind is that the hydraulics can get hot, and hydraulic oil expands when it gets hot. So it's a major bummer to go ahead and try and connect a hydraulic hose when your oil is hot in that line, and you cannot simply compress that oil to get that connection made. You're going to end up getting some tools, cracking the lines, relieving that pressure, putting it all back together. You probably made a mess in the meantime because the oil's spilling out. So try and take note of the features on your machine before you disconnect and relieve that pressure. This machine right here on the standard auxiliary hydraulics and high flow has what we call a pressure relieving valve. Many machines these days do, but older machines probably don't. And how you work that, imagine the hose being connected here. You're going to go ahead and push that hose, and you're going to push that cylinder circuit or that cartridge in, and by doing that, it's venting to the case drain line, which then drops that pressure significantly. You're going to relieve the pressure in the line on the attachment and in the machine when the machine is off. That way, when you come back to that attachment, you can go ahead and reconnect very easily, and that's on both the male and the female circuit. So take notes of features like that that can help you connect that machine. The other thing that's a good practice, and I wish I had one sitting out here in front of me, is when you disconnect the hydraulic hoses on an attachment, don't hesitate to connect the two halves together. That also creates a circuit there that allows that entire machine or that entire attachment to kind of be protected. It keeps the fittings out of the dirt, so you have less dirt to clean up if they were to drop into the material, but it also allows that pressure to kind of equalize in both lines. So those are some suggestions for the auxiliary hydraulics. And now I'll turn it over to Ted if he wants to talk about visibility.
We're actually going to cover structural damage on this one, and as we take a look at some of the structural damage areas, one of the most important things is take a look at the high stress areas, right? Like on this wheel loader as an example, we take a look at the loader frame. And the loader frame is a great place to take a look because maybe somebody has hit something extremely hard or there's something else going on. Signs of fatigue generally are starting to show where if there's paint flaked or you see paint flaked in stripes as an example where something has bent or moved or you know, been fatigued in any way, is a great opportunity. The other thing you want to take a look for is any other type of structural damage, whether those are guards, brackets, steps, things like that, to make sure that they aren't coming into contact with other components that could fail prematurely. So in this case, we'll use this as an example. Brad had been moving our machine earlier and had scuffed up this fender. Now, it's all kidding aside, in this case, it hasn't changed the shape of this fender. So the fender isn't into the tire or anything like that. But that's why these signs are extremely important. And in this case too, if I saw a sign like this, the first thing that I do is I inspect the steps to make sure that all my safety steps are intact. My handrails and guards are all there. So it's extremely important to monitor those because again, it seems like a small thing, but we've seen this lead to downtime as well. Okay.
Thanks, Ted. I appreciate that. Let's go ahead and talk about teeth, cutting edges. One of the major points or one of the key points on your machine is its ability to do work efficiently. You can always put more fuel into the machine for a diesel engine, right? But what's important is that fuel does lead to extra cost, more owning and operating cost, likely more heat in the machine if it's working inefficiently. And some things that are overlooked is using a tooth until it's literally ground down to nothing, okay? Same thing with cutting edges. So it's important to observe how your teeth are wearing. Do you have the right teeth on the machine for your application? Some teeth are better designed for harder materials. Some are better designed for soft materials. So it's really important to kind of investigate, are you using the right teeth or cutting edge for your application? And in the end, putting the right tooth on and using it within its normal useful life range gives you that efficiency in operation. So you're going to be able to cut into the material. You're going to be more productive in filling the bucket, filling the material, loading the material into a truck by having those newer teeth, those cleaner teeth, if you want to call it that, sharper teeth or edges on the machine. So that's a very key point to be aware of and maybe even investigate if you're using the right equipment setup for your operation.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about your operator environment and keeping that clean and why it's important. So we're going to use this excavator as an example. And obviously this is a newer machine, but as we open up the door in this, a couple things that really come into play. It rained here last night. We have mud all over our feet and boots. It's just the way that you know the business is. With that being said, as you track things in and out of the machine, why this is extremely important to keep this clean is that we do not want debris to build up underneath control, like in this case, our track drive, right? We don't want anything packing underneath that that's going to impede the operation of the machine from a safety standpoint. Debris that gets piled up underneath seat frames, things like that, leads to, seats that won't adjust correctly, as well as all of that material when it's inside of an area. We have a rubber mat on this machine, but if it's a steel floor in a machine, maybe an older machine, it promotes a lot of corrosion, unfortunately. And so that's why it's important to get that material out of there, make sure that it's clean, it has a chance to dry out. It also gives you that capability to go through and just make sure that all your controls fully function and move, in their full range of motion. Now, with that said, when we move into visibility a little bit with this as well, it's a great idea in case, for the machines that I operate, we keep Windex and rags in each machine. And that way we can clean, the windows as an example. We can clean the display a little bit if there's dust on it. But more importantly, in this case, we'll use this wheel loader. As you take a look at our mirror that's mounted up above here, in this case, as an operator, I can open up that side window and reach out there and clean the mirror. It's important that I make sure that those mirrors are adjusted properly so that I can see around me, especially if you have, multiple shifts or different operators that are running the same machine throughout the day. It is important, again, pay attention to your mirror adjustment. Once you have that mirror adjustment, in place, make sure that they're clean. And again, we'll get into talking a little bit about the cameras here coming up. The other thing that we want to talk to you about is before you go and start operating that machine, start thinking about maybe what pattern that machine was already in, right? Whether that be a skid steer and you can select or change your patterns just through the touch buttons that are in there, or in this case, if we take a look at an excavator, a lot of times we have a pattern control selector valve that's actually mounted, in this case, right behind the cab, and it's down inside of that area right there. And so it's important, especially, again, if you have mixed crews that are running that, maybe you have some people that are used to one pattern over another. Again, it's important, recognize that immediately when you first start some of your initial startups and tests, okay? So we also then want to talk a little bit about the cameras, right? Which this is a newer thing. Excavators, we have surrounding cameras that are up along the car body. We're going to use this skid steer as an example because the camera is really easy to see. So as we take a look at this, where it's extremely important is every morning when you're doing your daily service, Brad was already back here talking about your fluid checks, wipe the camera off. If you have a rag, whether I just did it with my finger, but make sure that that camera is nice and clean and clear. In addition to inside of the cab, the displays, if you're like me, I operate with the windows open a lot. So I tend to get a residual dust that builds on the displays. It's important, clean the displays off so that you don't have any, issues with seeing that display. And then also test it, right? In a wheel loader, as an example, I'm gonna need to have the engine running. I'm gonna shift into reverse after the park brake is released, and my camera will come on if it's equipped with a camera. So it's important to test that. Skid steer as well. Throw the lap bar down, push the operate button, move the control or controls depending on your pattern so that you can trigger that camera and you can make sure that it's working properly.
So I'm sitting in the CTL right now and kind of continuing Ted's discussion about cab cleanliness, the operator compartment, and even controls a little bit more. We're going to talk through a couple of the features here. So one of the things that we want to do is, one, we talked about buckets or attachments before. You want to make sure your attachment plate down here is clean and free of debris, right? You don't want to necessarily compress any dirt, any grass, any material over and over and over, which will restrict operation or even proper attachment of those attachments, okay? But beyond that, once you get into the machine, you definitely want to take note of your surroundings, like Ted was saying. Try and get rid of any material that might be restricting throttle pedals or even feet placement. A lot of machines don't even have full cabs, and sometimes that dirt can naturally collect in these machines over time. Take time to make sure your operating area is clean, like Ted was suggesting. Also take time to make sure your glass is clean, whether that's glass up on top, glass on the sides, or even on the door. That is going to be time well spent to make sure you've got a proper view 360 degrees around you, okay? On this machine, we've got a wide angle mirror up on top. If you need to, adjust it. And then also Ted was talking about the video camera. So make sure that you have that machine set up either when you go in reverse to show that video camera, or if it's available on whatever machine you're running, have that video camera turned on all the time so you've got that awareness. One of the worst things to happen would be for you to do your operation inspection, jump in the machine, start it up and run. You definitely want to take one last glance around you to make sure your operating environment hasn't changed suddenly without you knowing about it, okay? Now for controls. Ted talked about the control pattern selector. A lot of these style machines have new control pattern selection opportunities, whether it's ISO H, ISO to foot controls, the control pattern, excavator to backhoe style. So you're going to want to make sure those controls are set up for you. And that's the same thing for auxiliary hydraulics. You're going to want to take note of your devices, your switches on the consoles, or even in your handles, okay? Be aware of what the attachment control does with what switch in the machine. You want to definitely familiarize yourself so you're more prepared to get more work done. You don't want to jump onto a complicated attachment like a cold planer or something like that, start running and adjusting things incorrectly. You don't want to take too much material out or spend a lot of time reworking material that hasn't been taken out enough. So spend that time, understand your controls a little bit better, make sure you're aware of those switches, those functions that are aiding you in your production, and then go ahead and get to work, okay? Ted?
Okay. So what we want to do is talk a little bit about your daily startup procedure as well. So it's a good practice to be able to start a machine up, let it warm up a little bit just by simply idling. Idling, obviously, too long is a bad thing, but what I like to do is I start the machine up, I let the machine go through all of its self-checks. As it's warming up, I like to validate that all my lights are working. If I have strobe lights, if I have other types of lights that I know that I'm going to need because I'm operating at night, any of those things need to be in consideration of what's working, what's not. And then as that machine has been warming up, what I like to do then is look back at the display and make sure that we don't have any warnings or anything like that that are on the dash with a new fault code or something along those lines. If you have multiple shifts that are operating, make sure that you have a process for each shift to be able to communicate if there's anything that's been noticed or going on with that unit, right? Maybe there was an intermittent fault code that had popped up last night, but because it wasn't on when the operator shut it off, he didn't alert anybody. That could be really important because that might be leading up to a bigger downtime scenario. So have a process for that. The other thing that I like to do is also consider, when it comes to an emissions type of a warning, telling you that there's an emission system service due, or that you need to let the machine go through one of its cleaning cycles. Make sure that you follow this because a lot of times what happens is you only have so many opportunities to do that before the machine goes into a derated state. And that derated state does require dealer, intervene on the machine to make sure that it gets back up to the right operating performance that you expect. So these are important things to consider and be mindful of. Brad's going to talk to us a little bit about surroundings now.
Absolutely. So we've talked a lot about the machines, being aware of the components, the safety checks, the features like the maintenance items, the daily checks to make sure that machine keeps running. But one of the biggest pre-operation inspection things that you should be getting in the routine of is taking a walkthrough of your surroundings, right? Understand what's laid out in front of you on the job. A lot of people are operating on the same job site. Other operators are running to different job sites every day. So it's really important to get into the habit of, even if that machine is on the same exact job site every day, to do a quick survey of that job site. You never know what's happened in the last time you were on that job site. And so it's really important to make sure that you're aware of those. Maybe it's observing curbs that you want to avoid running over. You don't want to run a track system over those curbs and nick it, mar it, or rebar, or any kind of metal material. You want to avoid those things. So plan your route, observe where hills are. Make sure you understand where people might be entering your job site or leaving your job site from. Make sure that you've got gates or areas that are blocking people from getting into your job site. So be aware of those surroundings, kind of plan ahead. Identify focus areas that you want to avoid or pay more attention to while operating, because at any point, something can definitely interrupt your day, and we want it to be something minor, not something major. So with that, I'm going to ask you again to go ahead and submit questions at any point. I'm sure we've gotten a lot of them over the last 30 or 40 minutes, but keep asking questions. I think I'm going to go ahead and transition over to Bill now.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you, Ted, and thank you all at home for joining us today. If you've been following along with Case Live over the last few months, you'll see that winter has broken in the upper Midwest. We're out here in Racine, Wisconsin, the birthplace of Case. And I'm sorry, what's that? Brad, Ted, I'm getting a message from the control room. If you guys could look into the monitor there for a second. Can you guys play what you're talking about?
Awesome.
Thanks, Bill.
So you guys,
I've officially gotten my own cartoon.
you've officially got your own cartoon. You've been branded. You can thank Jessica Klein and the Case Live creative team for that one. And but just know that now everything you do, we have some official branding for you.
Thank you.
Now on to the official business of Brad and Ted's excellent Q&A adventure. Again, thank you all for hanging out with us here today. We've got a lot of our usuals as well as some new faces that have joined us here and are attending today, and we appreciate you taking the time. A few bits of housekeeping here. One, throughout the morning here, drop your questions into that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll take as many questions as we can. And if we don't get to your question, we will contact you after the show to discuss the topic that you asked about. Another element here, just a couple of housekeeping items. I'm going to drop a couple of links right now into the chat box, and what you'll see there is a few important things. You will see the a PDF of everything that Brad and Ted just talked about. It's printable, it's downloadable, and that's something that you could keep in your shop. You can give to your staff to keep in the machines, and that's something that they could look at on a day-to-day basis to follow along with the walk-around and elements that Brad and Ted just went through. The other is a link to our next Case Live event. You may remember Richie Snyder, and making his Case Live debut will be Nathaniel Waldschmidt, and on June 23rd we'll be talking about excavators and machine control, specifically excavators and machine control, and the things that you can do with excavators with that technology. And third and finally, there's a link to the brand new Case TCO ebook, which Brad and Ted helped develop. That is another great resource for you and your staff and your fleets to use to help keep your owning and operating costs down and to manage that critical total cost of ownership metric. So all of that set up here, I'll drop the links in here as the guys are answering this first question. But Brad, kind of a fun one that came in during the registration process. A gentleman by the name of Jonathan Kalin from Ohio sent in a question. He just bought his first brand new machine, a TV370B CTL. And his whole purpose of registering and tuning in today was he wants to know what are the critical things he has to look at with that CTL on a day-to-day basis. Do you want to give him a primer in what he should be looking for on that new machine?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for your question. It's an excellent question, something all new operators or less experienced people within the industry and operating equipment should definitely know. One of the things that I like to preach, and I used to do this in the commercial training organization, talked to a lot of customers about it, is develop a pattern to your walk-around, whether it's a pre or post-operation inspection. Develop a pattern. Post-operation or even pre, I normally start outside of the cab, right up here in the front corner. I kind of survey the machine, and then I kind of proceed around the machine in kind of a clockwise, or depending on the machine you're doing, counterclockwise manner. That way you're following the same pattern, you're developing consistency in what you're paying attention to and looking at. But to more specifically answer your question, you definitely want to look at hydraulics, the fittings, the grease points, and the tracks or tires most often, I would say. Or if those are the things you're going to key in on the most, those are the things that can kind of upset your day the most by not touching on them regularly, okay? So hydraulics, we talked about the attachment fitting point, but you're gonna look for leaks. You're gonna look for damage that might have occurred to the lines. Maybe materials that might be jammed in where the loader arms or the cylinders compress down, right? Anything that's gonna restrict operation or anything that's gonna lead you to believe that something happened on that machine or something might prevent me from operating well during the day. So you're gonna look at those things as you walk around the machine. You're gonna look at your tracks. Ted started out with this right away. Look at your tracks, observe your tracks, look for damage, chunks, mars, whatever. Look for material that's gonna be collected in your undercarriage. Obviously, a key point is always keeping your undercarriage clean, getting that material pulled out, making sure things aren't binding, making sure your rollers appear to be good, in good condition. Ensure that you don't have oil or leaks around those operating motors or those idlers or rollers, okay? As you continue around the machine, taking a quick glance at your engine compartment. We opened up the engine compartment at the beginning. Observe, make sure you don't have leaks or spill points or anything like that. look at some things. Obviously, the maintenance items, the routine checks will kind of build into your normal day-to-day inspection, but make sure that everything looks good. You want that consistency about how that machine looks, okay? So as you continue around the machine, close it up, and then continue navigating around that machine, doing the same thing, looking at your hoses up on top, looking at your hoses and your cylinders on the side of the machine, okay? You're gonna do that same thing on the opposite side, and then as you progress to the front of the machine, if you're doing a pre-operation inspection, take a good look over it, make sure your mirrors, your glass all appears to be in one piece, and then right before you go ahead and operate, jump into the machine, okay? Depending on your conditions, we're in kind of a sloppy weather with the rain that came last night, but always take caution in how you enter, okay? You can see I've already left a lot of dirt and material coming into the machine because of my wet shoes, so always be mindful of that too. We don't want you to go ahead and slip and fall on your way into the machine. So I hope that answers your questions enough. We can definitely take any more questions if I missed something offline, and we appreciate your time joining us today.
Thank you, Brad, and yeah, thank you again, Jonathan. Congratulations on your purchase of that new TV370B. That's always an exciting time when anyone gets to add to their fleet that way. And certainly, as Brad said, if you have any questions afterwards, we're more than happy to answer them for you. Question that has come in, Ted, this might be a good one for you. I've noticed that on some days my machine uses more DEF than on other days. Why is that?
Great question. So if you've ever noticed that you're using more DEF on one day versus another, there's several different things that come into play with the consumption of DEF. One of them is obviously and clearly engine load, right? If you're using that machine in a different application and you're working it harder, it's going to use more DEF. However, when you also start to consider even humidity has an impact on this. So if you're running in very dry climates, sometimes it will use more DEF. If it's highly humid outside like it is today here, chances are you're going to see actually a reduction in some of your DEF consumption. So these are things that can impact that amount of DEF that's being used, in addition to the DEF quality. If you're using a good quality DEF as well, you know, it may use less DEF then to be able to perform the same emissions functions.
And Ted, I'd like to just add in real quick. It's not only the quality, the brand or anything like that of the DEF. Make sure you've always got a good quality DEF, but it's also the age of the DEF that contributes to the quality over time. Right. An old DEF that's been sitting around naturally loses its, I'll say quote unquote potency, and you'll end up using more of that DEF. So make sure that you're using current DEF, new DEF, as well as a good quality DEF.
Right.
Thank you, gentlemen. Our good friend Yusef, who has joined us on a few of these events now, he threw out the question, is there a brand of attachments that you recommend more than another? And the answer to that, Yusef, is we work with a number of partners on a variety of attachments for all the different kinds of equipment. But maybe, Brad and Ted, the question I would throw out to you in response to Yusef's comment is talk a little bit about the flexibility of our equipment to work with a variety of different attachments and how we work with that.
Sure, absolutely. I can take that, and thank you very much for participating as often as you have, Yusef. Regarding the attachments, what you want is you want a known brand name or a company that you've got confidence with. You want to see good design to the attachment, so it looks like it's going to hold up over time. You want to see good welds, good strong or thick material that's being used for it. You want to see a logical arrangement to this bucket doesn't have hoses, but if there were hoses coming off of this attachment, you'd want to make sure those hoses are arranged properly, routed so they're not getting bound or caught up in things. So when it comes down to it, you're going to choose an attachment provider that's giving you the attachment that does the work you need it to do. Just spend some time observing what the attachment looks like. Don't just go for the first attachment that does the work like the first hammer you see and then buy it. Take note of those things. There's a lot of information online right now, and you always want to go ahead and observe what other people are saying about those attachments or those brands, and you definitely want to choose something that people have had success using in the past. Again, these machines aren't often a novelty that you operate on the weekends for fun, right? Most of the time, you're earning money, and so you want an attachment that provides value to you. So that's the main thing you want to do. Get something that's long-lasting, built well or built with quality, and make sure that you can depend on it, okay?
And Brad, maybe stay right about where you are, because the next question that has come in, and you touched on it during the main presentation, but a question comes in from the field. What happens if I run with worn or broken teeth or cutting edges for too long?
Oh, absolutely. So mentioned it a little bit during the original discussion, but running worn or broken teeth too long really leads to ineffective operation. The machine's going to work harder to go ahead and penetrate the pile, cut the earth, pry that material out of the ground, right? You're not going to be as effective in trying to drive that tooth into the ground. If you've ever, I'm sure many of you have, but if you've used a bad shovel or a brand new shovel, you immediately recognize the difference in being able to cut into the ground with that shovel. Same thing is happening with the machine. The machine is going to be less effective, you're going to use more fuel, the machine's going to run hotter, and you're likely going to be concentrating on trying to get a full material or a full bucket full of material if your teeth and cutting edges aren't working properly. And the more attention you drive to the things that should be doing their own job, the less attention you can apply to people operating around you, the job site, obstructions that you should be avoiding, a landscaper avoiding a house or a fence. You're going to be trying to get that material out of the ground, and you're going to be working harder at doing it, and you're going to lose focus on those other things. So those are some of the things that can definitely impact your profitability, your day, and your success on jobs if you're running with compromised teeth and bucket edges.
Thank you, Brad. Another question that has come in here. Ted, clearly someone was impressed. Where can I get a thermal imaging gun like the one you used in that display?
Yeah, so the thermal imaging guns, you can either use the temperature guns themselves. They're easy to find, many local stores, anywhere on the internet, really. When it comes to thermal imaging, again, there's a lot of solutions that are out there. There's solutions that plug into your existing phone, if you have an iPhone or an Android, and it can actually adapt to your phone so that you can record it, doesn't take up a lot of space. Or you can go really to like a really very professional camera like we use is actually called a LibreStream Cube. And that cube actually gives us that capability to do multiple things. Thermal imaging, temperature sensing, it gives us a reading, as well as it has different lighting and stuff like that to make sure that we are inspecting components to the maximum potential that we can. Like I said, a simple search that's out there is going to give you some options, and it's all going to boil down to how much you're going to use it. Obviously, for me being in service, we use these a lot so that we look for a higher quality camera that's out there. But if you're just using it periodically, just on a quick daily, things like that, you may not need that super high-end camera.
Thank you, Ted. Another question here from the field. Does the type of shoe on my steel track affect my owning and operating costs?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So let's move over to the excavator. That's always the fun part about live events, is that we never know which ones we're going to get. So as we take a look at this excavator, a couple things to make sure that we pay attention to. The width of the shoe, or the grouser as sometimes it's referred to, puts a lot of leverage on our chain that holds all these together. Too wide of a shoe for too hard of ground conditions or even rocky conditions puts a lot of additional leverage on that chain. That can increase the wear to your pins and bushings, and a lot of out there, your highest owning and operating costs with either a dozer or an excavator is the undercarriage. It's extremely important to understand what size shoes that you need. The wider the shoe, the better the flotation, right? And the better stability if you're on a soft ground. But at the same time, if you're one of a customer that has experienced, the track shoe retaining hardware loosening quite often, or even worse, you've seen links crack, that's an indication that the shoe is too wide. And by going to a narrower shoe, it reduces that leverage on the chain. It's going to reduce that same opportunity of loosening hardware, cracked hardware, or excessive wear associated with the chain rails and things like that. So that's what I would inspect, or at least be cognizant of.
Thanks, Ted. And we've got actually two questions here related to coolant. One question is, can you explain to me again what OAT is? And then another question that came in similar to that is, what happens again if I mix OAT coolant or extended life coolants with conventional coolant?
I can take that.
Okay.
So let's walk over to the machine here. OAT coolant, let's answer that first. So OAT coolant is organic acid technology coolant. It's basically extended life coolant. Extended life coolants in the industry have become really popular because they've increased the interval at which you need to change that coolant on the machines, lowering your total cost of ownership, okay? those coolants are different than the traditional ethylene glycol. They're made up of some ethylene glycol or the same type of materials, but they are different and they should not be mixed. What happens is the organic acid technology coolant, that OAT or extended life coolant, literally congeals or thickens up if it's combined with normal ethylene glycol. And so it's something you definitely don't want to do, okay? The newer machines, extended intervals, all the OEMs are looking at, impacting the operator's left, extending the interval at which you change the hydraulic oil, the coolant, the transmission oil, whatever that might be. And by doing that, we are lowering the cost of owning and operating these machines for operators like yourselves. So be aware if your machine is new enough that it has that extended OAT or extended life coolant in it. Case does something where we put a tag on the coolant that says, or on the coolant fill spot that says stop, OAT coolant only. So we're trying to inform people that something is different on this. I'd love to tell you that there's a consistent color that you can reference to say, this color equals the extended life coolant, but unfortunately, depending on where you get it or who's supplying it to you, it does have a few different colors that you can reference. So just take time, look at the operator's manual, see what the factory supplies in that machine, and stick to that. If you need to change it, if you prefer to change it to the opposite, you can. Either system will operate with that, standard ethylene glycol or the extended life coolant. But what you need to do is make sure you drain the coolant completely, flush it even once, and then put the new coolant in. You don't want to have any residual of the opposite in there that can decrease your cooling capacity on that machine.
Thank you, Brad. And we've got time for just a couple more questions. Brad and Ted would sit here and talk with you guys all afternoon if we let them. But throw your questions in the Q&A box. We've got time for just a couple more. One question here that came in, we've talked a little bit about steel tracks, but just a question of what are the things that I should look for on the steel tracks on my excavator on a daily basis?
Great question, and I'll take that one. So a couple things that you want to monitor. The real thing about undercarriage is it's all about establishing inspections in a trend, right? We want to be able to monitor to see if there's any strange wear patterns or characteristics early on, because that's when you can actually make adjustments or do different things, whether that be maybe changing operation or maybe it's an adjustment on the machine that we need to pay attention to. Track tension is critical to your life on a steel undercarriage machine. The other thing that I like to do is I like to take a look periodically, and sometimes they're a little harder to see, but in this case you can see one of our bushings and pins that's down in here right before it's engaging in with the sprocket. I like to go through and I try to take a look at those. I can lean down and look up into the undercarriage as well and then see those bushings. What you're looking for is if that bushing, brand new, is just a piece of round tubing, and that tube, right, I mean, as it wears, you're going to start to see some patterns that wear into that. When you start to notice that pattern start wearing, which is normal, it is important, though, that you have, in a conversation with your case dealer, have them get into the habit of doing an undercarriage appraisal on your machine. So that way you can also forecast when you're going to have to actually change the undercarriage or make some sort of, significant repair, because then you can schedule that downtime so that it's not something that's happened right immediately in the field. And for those of you that have ran before where, tracks are loose or you've tossed the track, it certainly eats up a lot of hours in the day trying to put those components back on and get up and running again.
Thank you, Ted. And another question here, another excavator-related question. What is the most commonly overlooked checkpoint on an excavator?
One of the most common points that I would say that gets overlooked is actually greasing the lower swing bearing. So inside of our swing assembly, we have a swing motor, and then there's a reduction housing that has multiple different gears that reduce or give us that additional torque to swing the machine. Depending on the size of the excavator, those can either be wet lubricated by the machine itself, or some are actually greased. And one of the things that we often see is that it's an area that's not easy to get to, so it gets overlooked. But the other side of it that we've seen is where a customer actually notices it and they over-grease it. There are certain components that should not be over-greased. This is one of the areas that is that way. I would tell you to refer to your ops manual. A lot of times it will tell you in a scale of 3 pumps of grease annually or something along those lines. That's the key information that you need, because over-greasing it can actually damage those components. And like I said, it's something that's clearly overlooked because it's in a difficult spot to get to. It is not a daily service point either, which I think kind of gets out of, like Brad was talking about, establishing a routine. That one's a little more, periodic type maintenance.
Thank you, Ted.
Okay.
And that brings an end to our Case Live. Thank you all for the lively discussion. Thank you all for tuning in. And thank you to Brad and Ted for being such good sports. Did you want to close out with anything, Brad? Nope.
No, we definitely appreciate the operators out there putting their time in, doing the jobs on a day like today or any other day that might be a little bit less than perfect like now. So we appreciate your time. Please don't hesitate to ask questions to us or your dealers when you have the need. We're out there to support you and make sure that your operation is profitable and gets it done on time.
Right. And thanks for participating today. We look forward to talking to you guys in the future on some new topics.
I'm Brad.
I'm Ted, and we'll see you in the field.
You knew they were going to do it. You knew you knew it was inevitable. Just again, a quick programming note. We'll be back here Wednesday, June 23rd with Richie Snyder and Nathaniel Waldschmidt. That's going to be a good time talking about excavators and machine control. Thank you again. We will see you hopefully on another bright sunny day like today on the next episode of Case Live. Thank you.